This is a special presentation from News Channel 9, WSYR Syracuse.
And it was a very eerie feeling, the atmosphere, the sky, it was different.
We could hear it rumbling probably 15 minutes to 30 minutes ahead of time. It was the first time in my life I'd ever heard anything like this coming.
And all of a sudden, kaboom, for about 10 minutes.
I got up and I looked out and the sky was literally green.
I mean, the car was just rocking back and forth. I was seeing the stop signs, the power lines, the trees blowing.
It was dark. You expect things to be lit up at night in an urban environment, and it wasn't, and that was a real creepy feeling.
There were power lines down everywhere. It kind of looked like a ghost town.
We just couldn't believe what we saw, because this huge steeple was just right down in the middle of the street.
And we were starting to get a sense then just what we were dealing with was not just your typical little storm. This was a disaster.
Good evening, I'm Storm Team Chief Meteorologist Jim Teskey. Anyone that lived through the Labor Day storm of 1998 has a memory of it. It raced through central New York just after midnight on Labor Day morning and left a path of destruction unlike any storm we've seen before or since. Thousands of trees were destroyed, changing the landscape. 250,000 people were left without power, some for up to a week, and at the state fairgrounds, 2 people lost their lives. It was a vivid reminder of the power of nature. Over the next hour, we'll take a look back at the fury of the storm and how it formed, the hardships that Central New Yorkers endured, and how the community pulled together as we look back. The Labor Day storm, 20 years later.
The storm struck right at the end of the long 3-day Labor Day weekend. It was the unofficial end of summer.
Nice catch.
Trips to the beach were planned. Grills were ready for a final barbecue. For still others, Labor Day would be a chance to check out what was expected to be a record crowd at the New York State Fair. Through Sunday night, they were just 20,000 people shy of breaking 1 million visitors for the first time.
Even on a holiday weekend, news was happening. One of our videographers, Eddie Jones, was out covering an overnight news story. It was just before 1:30 on Labor Day morning when Eddie took a detour coming into the city of Syracuse. He was traveling along North State Street, and then he took a turn onto Hickory. It's at that point when the full fury of the storm hit.
Oh, Lord, please. What am I doing here? Oh. The car was just rocking back and forth. I was seeing the stop signs, the power lines, the trees blowing. I decided to try to roll down the window on my left-hand side to try to shoot on the opposite side. That didn't work because the rain was just coming in. It was like being in a wind tunnel. But then you had all this rain that was coming down and debris. But the next thing I know, whoosh, that came in. And it came fiercely. I can't describe that. I've never been in a hurricane or anything like that. But the car, I thought was going to tip over. And I was scared. I've never been scared in my life. I mean, you know, but I was really scared. I started saying my prayers.
As soon as the worst of it let up, Eddie was one of the first people to document the storm and the damage it had done to Syracuse. It was the middle of the night, so at first it was tough to assess just how bad the damage was.
So then I went down James Street, and that's where I saw tons of water just going down the street. And at that time, the fire department, Syracuse Fire Department, were out of quarters and going to scenes. And when I was driving, you can hardly drive because there were, you know, trees down, limbs down in an area. So I just went around trying to get the fire department, try to get this areas, because I was listening to the scanners where everything was, because it was sporadic. It was pitch dark, you understand. So if there was bad damage, I really couldn't see much of that. I know that driving through the streets to try to navigate through that was very hard and things of that sort. But I didn't know the extent of the damage until I got back, gave that, and then they sent a crew out because I heard about, you know, the fairgrounds.
By Labor Day morning, other crews picked up the storm coverage from where Eddie left off. While he may have gotten some of the most gripping video of the storm, to this day, Eddie considers himself one lucky guy.
I guess looking back, what really chilled me is that I was on the side of a brick building. And then when I saw the video from the helicopters of buildings similar to that, with the bricks had fallen down, that scared me because I went, thank God. I really did, because that could have been me.
While Eddie was out covering the immediate aftermath of the storm, government agencies were mobilizing to deal with what was quickly becoming apparent. Syracuse and much of Onondaga County was dealing with a disaster.
Is there anybody else that's involved? Send them up. Okay.
Nick Pirro, the county executive at the time, got the word very quickly.
Well, within, I think, 5 minutes, I had a phone call from Pete Alberti, our emergency manager, who said, Nick, he said, we got a real bad storm had hit. He said, there's problems from the fairgrounds in through the city. In fact, we might have a fatality at the fairgrounds.
We're encouraging no unnecessary travel by any of the citizens of Onondaga County.
The county immediately started setting up their command center in the basement of the Civic Center. This allowed for a quicker response.
Everybody comes here with authority. They don't have to check with somebody else. They can, they can call the shots, so to speak, and that's critical in an emergency, especially when, happens in the middle of the night. You can't see exactly what's going on, and you've got to have contact with a lot of people.
Your address?
7185.
The response to the storm had begun, but there was lots of work to be done. Trees were down and the power was out on a scale we had not seen before. Lives were changed. Everyone who lived through it has a story. We'll share some of those stories when we return.
The Labor Day Storm, 20 years later on News Channel 9, sponsored by Bartlett Tree Experts, Homer Men's and Boys Store, and by Surf Pro.
For 40 years, News Channel 9 carried the Jerry Lewis Muscular Dystrophy Telethon on Labor Day weekend. And most years we would do local cut-ins till about 1 o'clock in the morning and then send everybody home for a quick rest before we'd start up again on Monday.
The national portion of the MDA Telethon just finished up in Television City in Hollywood.
For some reason, that year we decided that we were going to break after midnight instead of 1 o'clock. And if we hadn't made that decision, we would have sent probably 30 or 40 people right into the heart of the storm. I don't have any idea why we made that decision way back in the spring, but it sure was lucky that we did.
In central New York, the Labor Day weekend means the end to the New York State Fair. And in 1998, they had a great run. Hundreds of thousands of people came through the turnstiles. In fact, they were on the cusp of breaking 1 million visitors for the first time ever. But there would be no record in 1998. There would be no final day of the fair. The storm literally turned things upside down here at the fairgrounds.
Well, if you look...
Peter Capasilli was the director of the fair at the time. Just after the fair closed at midnight Sunday, he made his typical sweep of the grounds. That was about an hour before the storm struck. There were still roughly 2,000 people there, including support staff, vendors, and exhibitors.
And it was a very eerie feeling, the atmosphere, the sky. It was different. It was much different than we had ever seen any other night. And the animals were a little funny, acting a little funny also. And we knew that there was something up.
Fairgrounds on you calling.
Word reached the fair before 1 a.m. that a bad storm was coming, and before 1:30 that morning, the storm had come and gone, causing major destruction.
All county roads are closed. All roads in the county are closed.
What is your first concern once the storm is over?
I ran as fast as I could right down here to the youth building. We had 800 kids in this building. My only concern at that point was, are they all right? Are they all right? Ran as fast as I could, opened the doors. They were all sound asleep, thank God. They had no idea what had just happened. And that was a silver lining blessing in itself.
While the youth building was spared, other parts of the fairgrounds were hit hard, and 2 people lost their lives. The first, Burl Stone, was in a trailer near the stables. He was getting ready to show his horses for the first time on that Labor Day. The second, Butch Perry, was keeping guard at the popular Santillo's food stand near the dairy building.
As the storm took a turn here on this street, from the Family Fun Center and from Food Row, it ripped the roof off of the Dairy Products building right there. Yep. And the roof was like a monster sheet that just flew in the air and landed right on the Santillo stand, which was right here, which had Mr. Perry in it.
Everything was breaking up, the glass was flying, top of that building. piece of it blew off and hit him. The wind took me up about 10 feet in the air, and finally the beam started breaking, and a twirling gust came at me, threw me against the panel. It's just been hell.
As heart-wrenching as it was, Capicilli says the human toll at the fairgrounds could have been much worse.
My son-in-law pushed the door open and says, "Come on, follow me." We ran, we jumped in the truck, and the whole thing flipped over.
The route that that wind shear, that tornado, whatever it was, took was probably the best route it could take to save lives.
Could everybody come out of their camper? We'll give you an update. There will not be a fair today.
You just recall tents down, stands down, and it just reminded you of footage that you would see on TV of a storm in another state. This was something we were not familiar with. It was something we had never experienced.
It's unbelievable.
In 1998, Niagara Mohawk was the main power company in central New York. Earlier in the year, they dealt with another major power outage as a result of the North Country ice storm.
Al here.
Now another weather disaster was unfolding in central New York, and John Spink, now Vice President of Control Operations at NYMO's successor National Grid, could sense that right away.
The thing that, as I was driving in, and you've probably heard it before, it's an eerie feeling when you're driving and there's no lights. You know, people say, oh, it's dark out. It's a different dark when there's no lights at all. And as you're driving and being in the utility and you don't see any lights, you know, and you're looking around, you know it's not a localized issue. This is big.
And coming into work, John was already making calls to his system group to assess the situation and determine how many crews would be needed to restore power.
And I says, I need so many crews. And they were very seasoned in, and they said, look, I drove in, we're gonna double that, you need more. You know, and so we started right away.
It's clear that this is a storm that's gonna take a significant amount of time before everybody is back. Some people will be restored relatively quickly. Others, the final people to be restored, may take a week or longer. So people should be planning in some areas for an extended outage.
In the wake of the storm, about 250,000 people around central New York were without power, some for up to a week. At the peak of the recovery, there were a total of 500 line crews in the field, some from as far away as Detroit and Quebec, all working 18-hour shifts to get the power back on.
If you're just tuning into us here at News Channel 9, rather unusual conditions at this point. We are operating on emergency power.
Our coverage at News Channel 9 was challenging those early hours of Labor Day morning. While we were able to get warnings out before the storm hit, we, like so many in central New York, lost power. That meant there was no power for our studio lights, our cameras, or even our control room.
How was I going to do a broadcast? So they opened up the door. They put the generator to the live truck on, and they hooked up a camera, and we made a makeshift studio with flashlights as my light in my face. We got a microphone to work, we got a field camera to work, and we were on the air broadcasting in a very primitive style, but we got it done.
The officials and emergency crews are trying to do their best to get to areas where there are trees and power lines down to help people that may need help.
So we made do with what we had. We had a lack of information. Slowly but surely we started getting information in from the city and the county. But it was so limited that over that time period, we found that we were just repeating ourselves over and over. And as the morning developed and we were able to get people in and the officials, not the governmental officials on a city and a county level, started getting control of the situation, that's when we really were able to start providing people with information.
What happened was the shed lifted up over, flew through the air across the street, and that's where it is right now. It's basically in their neighbor's yard.
Our reporters and photographers were fanning out throughout Syracuse and central New York, gathering information, sound, and pictures of what had happened. And some of the worst damage occurred right in Syracuse, hitting a spiritual center particularly hard. The story of St. Lucy's coming up next as the Labor Day storm 20 years later continues. Father Jim Matthews has been at St. Lucy's Church for the past 27 years. It has a long history serving the needs of the residents of the near west side, but some may not have heard of St. Lucy's before the Labor Day storm. However, if you mention St. Lucy's today, people who were here at the time know exactly what you're talking about. Some of the worst damage ended up here.
I could hear this huge crash, and after a while I walked outside, and there's a whole lot of people from the neighborhood out looking at the steeple that had been blown probably 100 feet down the street. And everybody kind of came together, and the trees are down, the power lines are down, and just a whole lot of people saying something that was really extraordinary. The neighborhood was blacked out, and everybody was talking to one another about, what we are witnessing.
So the storm hit and you saw the steeple was down. When did you realize that the bell wasn't there?
Well, it probably took a couple of days, as I recall, because it was all dark that night. Obviously, there's no power there. And it took us a while to get into the basement because of the danger and the damage done to the building itself. It was a danger to get in there. So it took a while to really get in there and be able to discover the bell is in the basement. Considering that the bell came down right near that stained glass window, the amazing thing is that the window was intact except for a small crack, and the crack was on the steeple. The picture of the church that's in the rose window, the crack was on the steeple that crashed.
So there's some symbolism there.
Well, so you can, interpret it any way you want. There's a lot of symbolism going on. The whole top of the church was just ripped open. The timbers were hanging down, and asbestos or dust covered the whole church. So most of the damage was confined to the front, but the rest of the church was really pretty much of a mess.
The damage to St. Lucy's during those few minutes of ferocity was about $1 million, and it was apparent there would be no services that following Sunday and for many Sundays to come. So Father Matthews and the rest of the parish had to go to Plan B. That was the gymnasium across the street.
We went over to the gymnasium, and we decided, let's see if we can reconfigure the way the congregation is going to gather. And so we set it up in the form of a U, where the altar was in the middle and all the chairs were around it. People loved it.
The toppled steeple drew a lot of attention, but the focus became rebuilding the inside of the church.
It was part of our discussion as we talked about reconfiguring the church. We said, well, why put all the money into the sky? So we just capped it off, and it saved, a substantial amount of money.
Steeple or not, there was little doubt what would happen when they returned to the rebuilt church over a year later.
To celebrate a liturgy here is just a great experience. Because there's such good participation from the people, and it's eye-to-eye contact. It's getting rid of this me up here and these people down here. Because we all have a part to play in the liturgy. We all have a part to play. I'm not the only show, These people have a lot to offer, and I want to give them the opportunity to share the gifts that God has given to them.
You've leveled the playing field.
Well, that's perfect. I like it. Isn't it funny how things work out like that? You have a tragedy that almost closed the church, but so many wonderful offshoots from that. And we just kind of celebrated how great people were to us and how we had a chance to do this whole reconfiguration. And I think everybody loves the way the church is set up here.
Central New York was cleaning up and rebuilding after the storm, but coming up next, we'll take a step back and look at the meteorological setup for such a destructive force of nature when the Labor Day storm 20 years later continues.
We all know about how bad Syracuse got hit. Syracuse seemed to be right in the, the path of the storm, and the destruction in this metropolitan area was so widespread. and so devastating. But I went into Cuga County, northern Cuga County, parts of Port Byron and the town of Montezuma, where the main church in Port Byron was flattened.
It was just devastating. It scared the heck out of you.
At first I didn't even notice this. I drove around back and saw the roof torn off, and then came back around and saw the access to the building in the front here where it shouldn't be.
I heard two big boom, boom, not like something breaking, but the lightning hitting.
And also over into parts of Oneida County and Madison County. Those people were picking up the pieces too.
On the Sunday leading up to Labor Day, there was concern for strong, even severe thunderstorms. A cold front was approaching central New York and the Northeast, and although not record-breaking, unseasonably warm air was approaching 90 degrees throughout the region, along with sultry dew points in the 60s to near 70. The surprising thing that afternoon was not only were there no severe thunderstorms, there were no thunderstorms in our part of the country, period. The radar screen was blank. In hindsight, that was a telltale sign. If a few thunderstorms had popped that Sunday afternoon, that would have released some of the energy in the atmosphere driven by the heat and the humidity. In a sense, it would have served as a release valve. As sunset approached, it looked like perhaps central New York was out of the woods. We would be moving out of our peak daytime heating, plus severe thunderstorms overnight in this part of the country were rare. However, temperatures stayed very warm through the evening, and even more moisture moved in aloft ahead of the approaching cold front, along with strong jet stream winds. Plenty of fuel remained for the cold front to work with. Just before 10 p.m. brought the first signs of trouble. Thunderstorms formed northwest of Toronto, then quickly crossed into western New York close to 11 o'clock. The storms would not weaken as they crossed Lake Ontario and moved into central New York. The average lake temperature was still 72 degrees that weekend.
I had a clear view to the northwest of this thing approaching, and you know, after many years of working in severe storm country, particularly in Oklahoma, you kind of get to see things for what they are. And the lightning that this storm was producing was to the likes I haven't seen since, oh geez, one tornadic storm that went through Tulsa, for example.
The storms then quickly swept through central New York between 1 and 1:30 in the morning. The line bowed as it moved right through Syracuse, a sign of the strong winds dropping through the storm, forcing the leading edge of the storm to accelerate. Hurricane-force winds were recorded at the Syracuse airport, but even stronger winds, as strong as 115 miles per hour, moved through the southern part of the city, University section, into the eastern suburbs. While the damage immediately made people assume a tornado had struck, a storm survey conducted by the National Weather Service suggested otherwise. Visiting site after site of damage, they came upon trees brought down by the storm facing in one direction.
As this storm went through, it was not only producing its straight-line damaging winds broadly across the area, but within that, from the air, we could see pockets of even more extreme localized damage, which I'm associating with probably downward torrents of rain that this storm was just dropping as it went along, embedded inside the rain associated with the storm.
Even where there's grass, like over there the grass is a little higher, it's blowing so hard it actually flattened the grass in that direction too. And that matches with the damage over there. I don't even know if there's any rotation to it. Just a derecho, and I think there was 100 knots of wind.
A new word entered the weather vocabulary of central New Yorkers that Labor Day morning, derecho. The term is used to describe a line of severe thunderstorms that can last many hours and travel hundreds of miles, causing damage due to these strong straight-line winds. In fact, the term derecho comes from the Spanish word straight. The storm that devastated Syracuse shortly after midnight reached the East Coast near Boston by 6 a.m. Labor Day morning. If you had driven the thruway in Massachusetts Pike at close to the speed limit, this storm would have likely outrun you. It was a unique setup for central New York that has yet to be duplicated in the 20 years since the Labor Day storm. The storm had come and gone, but there was plenty of work to do, and central New Yorkers were up to the task. That story, as the Labor Day storm 20 years later, continues.
The generators, the chainsaws, it was like you could hear the sound of the chainsaws for weeks. It was like the background noise for central New York. And everywhere you drove around, you heard it.
The trees, They were down everywhere. They were on houses. They were on cars. They were on power lines and in roads, which was the #1 issue for Niagara Mohawk initially.
In an event like this, you have to get the tree crews in first, because the line crews can't get in. They can't work because the trees are down all the way, so you have to clear. And that was a lot of the, getting around and getting areas accessible so we could get the crews in. So that's where you partner up with the towns and the county, and they do a lot of help. It's the one thing that I've learned over the years is the partnerships are invaluable.
I remember the state come in and said, oh, it's going to take 2 to 3 months to clean this up. Well, one thing I got to say is our Department of Transportation people said, we're going to go to work on this. And along with the city, we set up a center at one of the parking lots at the Fairgrounds. Our guys brought in what they call tub grinders, and it took a little less than 3 weeks to get everything cleaned up.
The damage to the Niagara Mohawk power grid was extensive. It wasn't so much transmission. They were still able to generate power. It was the distribution side of things. All those power poles, over 5,000 poles were down over central New York, and that meant a certain plan had to be followed.
In the Labor Day storm, the city was devastated. And sending 1 or 2 crews in there, and I remember this, wouldn't have done anything. And I didn't send people into the city except for what we would call a 911, an emergency. And people were saying, geez, there's nobody in the city. Well, sending 5 crews isn't going to do anything. We waited for the next day. We brought all these crews in and attacked it that way.
As the city and county officials, along with utility companies, got to work getting the infrastructure back to normal, the rest of the community pitched in and in typical central New York fashion, did the little things to aid in the recovery.
A lot of neighborhoods who probably hadn't really been that close before Labor Day got very close of necessity in the days that followed, helping each other clean up, sharing what food was left until the power finally came back on, doing anything they could do, because this really was a situation where we were all in it together, and neighbors helping neighbors was really the rule of the day.
I was impressed at the work of neighborhoods, neighbors sticking together and helping each other out during their time of need. Of course, so many people without power, so many people without phone.
Everybody wanted to know, how is everybody doing? Are you okay? Is your family okay? I know you have relatives in this area and it was hit hard. And, in times of tragedy, it is true that people do come together, and Central New Yorkers have always been that way, looking out for one another, very resilient, resourceful.
People were clamoring to try and find ice. And I just also remember the human spirit that emerged, which was something that I'd never seen before.
Once the image of the damage got outside Onondaga County, the people were pitching in all over the place. I mean, it was prevalent in our news stories.
For days after the storm, thousands of central New Yorkers had to deal with power outages. People were buying batteries and generators at local hardware stores just as quickly as they could be stocked.
We have another truck coming in right now with more batteries and flashlights. And tomorrow morning we have a truck coming directly from Eveready with lots more flashlights and lots more lantern batteries.
Without power for refrigerators and freezers, food went bad, so local fast food restaurants were mobbed with hungry customers.
Good morning and welcome to McDonald's. Can I take your order, please?
People also flocked to local hotels that did have power, all in an attempt to bring back some sense of normalcy.
It's inconvenient without any power. So, the baby doesn't want wants to watch TV, doesn't understand that the thunder took the TV away, took the power away.
So many people were still without power the weekend after the storm. Syracuse University opened up Manley Fieldhouse so fans could watch the Orange and Donovan McNabb take on Michigan, a game SU ended up winning. All these years later, signs of the storm remain, like the tree damage in Oakwood Cemetery. The changes that are still happening today, next on the Labor Day storm 20 years later.
It's quiet now in Oakwood Cemetery near Syracuse University, but it was a different scene 20 years ago. Some of the strongest winds from the Labor Day storm blew through here, changing the historic cemetery forever.
This evening, Oakwood Cemetery's a quiet place, a perfect night for Dan Glavin to walk with his daughter. But it's not a perfect night. It reminds Dan of pictures he's seen of World War II European cities after a bombing.
Who knows if it will ever be what it once was.
This arch is a monument to Monday's storm. It leveled trees, which leveled headstones and monuments. This piece used to be on top of this piece, which used to be on top of this piece. All family plots are destroyed. The greatest tragedy? The landscape of this cemetery could stay like this forever.
In the short time it took the storm to race through the cemetery, just 5 to 10 minutes, it's estimated that 25% of the trees were lost, and that's just a fraction of the thousands of trees that came down all over central New York that night. Even though the storm blasted through in just minutes, the impact on trees in places like Oakwood Cemetery are still being felt today.
Well, I mean, the things that you see are like...
Don Leopold is a professor at SUNY ESF and an authority on trees. He still sees the impact of the Labor Day storm every day on his way to work. His office is on the northern boundary of the cemetery. It was the day after Labor Day when he was able to grasp the full extent of the damage to Oakwood Cemetery.
The very next day, I walked into work, and on the way between Thurber and the Colvin area, all the trees were down on the road. I think Comstock was still closed, so I walked into work, and then part of walking into work is right through the cemetery, and I think that's when I really understood how bad it was. There's some really nice hardwoods in here, especially the oaks and a lot of sugar maple. The sugar maple really took a beating, so initially they were really ripped up, and I thought that they would recover, but they never did. So we've lost, even as late as maybe 5 years ago, there are still trees that have been lost in the cemetery due to that major event in September of '98.
Trees that in other locations might have been cut down were left standing, making Oakwood a living laboratory to tree regrowth. Some of the damage, like the missing crown on this blue spruce, is quite obvious, but for other trees you really have to get up close to see the damage.
So this oak is another great example of the regrowth here in the cemetery, right? Explain what happened with this tree.
So oaks and a lot of other hardwoods typically are able to sprout when their crowns are damaged. Well, in this case, the crown was completely ripped out. There was nothing left of it. So it was just like almost like a telephone pole.
Yeah.
But these side branches formed and have now formed a new crown. The issue with this tree will be that side branch in just 20 years is already pretty good size. Project another 20 years. If it's twice that size, the tree will not be stable. So either the whole tree is going to come over or that branch is going to break off. There's just no way that branch can be supported by this weak column of wood that's left. So it's another example where the story isn't over yet.
In other areas, like Comfort Tyler Park across Colvin Street from the cemetery, the change came more quickly, in part because of the extensive damage.
It was initially a shock to see every single tree down in this park because they were mature and it was pretty much almost a contiguous canopy.
However, it turns out having all the trees come down in the storm was a blessing in disguise. It allowed for planting a whole new park with trees that wouldn't grow more than 35 feet high and with a much better diversity that would protect the park from more than just storms.
Another thing that you do if you're trying to have a resilient landscape is to not have nothing but one tree species, because if an insect or disease comes in, American elm was a great example, then they all go down as dominoes. So now if an insect or disease issue comes up, there's such a diversity of trees in this park that those insects and diseases aren't going to get very far. They might kill 1 or 2 trees, but they can't go beyond that. So you've really made this about as resilient as you possibly can make an urban park.
Now, instead of all Norway maples, the park has a mix of oak, maple, Siberian spruce, and serviceberry that dot the landscape.
But I think the extensive planting that took place, I think, was primarily because of the Labor Day storm, and I think that rallied the neighborhood. There's been so many more people engaged with the park at a level that wasn't the case before 1998. I think it's a much more inviting place. There's niches for everybody here, and to me it's aesthetically much more pleasing than what it was before the 29 Norway maples were blown over.
Central New York survived and rebuilt after the storm, but all these years later, are we prepared for the next major weather event? Some answers coming up on the Labor Day storm 20 years later.
Half a house is better than none because the couple that lived here is still living. As the storm bore down, Bonnie Warwick got out of bed to close the kitchen windows, then tried to make it back to the bedroom. The rushing wind had already ripped apart their home, and the bedroom door would not open.
You couldn't get it open from this side?
No.
And he couldn't get it open from the inside?
On the other side. And he just grabbed me and said there wasn't anything else we could do but just get on the floor beside the bed, between the wall and the bed. And he just laid on top of me until it was all over with. It seemed like an eternity. And I just prayed out to God to spare our lives, and he did.
It sounded like a freight train going through, and then as we're laying there, it sounded like somebody took a huge sledgehammer, was hitting the house, and that must have been about the time the roof went off the house, and the garage picked up and ended up down by the road.
What's left of their kitchen, dining room, and living room is covered with a blue tarp and insulation. Up the road, a cell phone tower still stands, but not Robin Kaz's back wall.
After it went through, I come down and I said, "The wall is missing." And he says, my husband said, "What do you mean the wall is missing?" I said, "The wall's missing."
And so is the power, for now, throughout this area. New York State Electric and Gas is restoring the juice, and while it does, NYSEG is giving out free blocks of dry ice to keep cold foods cold.
With the Labor Day storm 20 years in the rearview mirror, how prepared is Central New York for the next big storm? Are government agencies ready? Do power companies have the pieces in place for when the power goes out again? And what about us in the media? Well, here at News Channel 9, it was the Labor Day storm that played a major role in us getting live Doppler 9 here in Pompey. You see it on our weathercasts every day, you get it online, but it was always envisioned to be something beyond just that.
Live Doppler 9 was more than just a project just for this television station in Niagara Mohawk. We decided right from the get-go that this was going to be a community project. So we were supplying what we call raw radar data. That's not the pictures that viewers see. This is the actual raw numerical data via our broadcast signal to emergency management, 911, fire department.
The effects of the Labor Day storm also spurred meteorological developments that impact the forecast you see every day.
Events like this advance technology. A good example of this was after the storm, Jeff Waldstreicher, who was the science information officer at the National Weather Service in Binghamton, decided, I wonder if the small-scale computer models could pick up on this. So he took the weather from the Sunday to before, put it into the model, told the model, now run. And the model actually was able to forecast that Labor Day storm with surprising accuracy. And as a result of seeing that, we started running our own models here at Channel 9. That's what eventually led to the whole concept of the time capsule.
By the time you get to the lunch hour, some showers and storms beginning to develop. Those computer models continue to improve and show us more details about weather systems approaching central New York. Systems that could spawn the next Labor Day storm. And speaking of the next storm, power companies continue to fine-tune their plans to get the power on as quickly as possible.
Today, though, to be honest, we're more on top of it as far as the technology, the tracking of it coming in, being able to get crews ahead of time. We have more technology that we can switch things remotely. Can you staff for everything? No, but there's a very good infrastructure amongst utilities and vendors that you can start calling for poles and equipment, and they can get it to you within a day.
And for power companies like National Grid, the relationships that they've built up with the different governmental agencies have prepared them even better 20 years after the Labor Day storm. Communication is key.
So if there's a storm or emergency, it doesn't have to be a storm, could be another type of emergency. We have someone dedicated to each county We talk to them several times a week, whether we think there's bad weather coming, whether we think there's a heat wave coming, or when a storm is on its way. And we talk to them in advance, tell them what we're going to do, and then staff there.
Called in from there.
While the response of the different government agencies was quick in the wake of the Labor Day storm, the improvements to the command centers, like this one for Onondaga County, continue to this day, all in the name of being ready for the next disaster.
We also knew at that point in time that our technology and our ability to track things and everything wasn't the best, in that there was technology out there that could improve on it. And I think that this place has been improved probably 3 times since then. Yeah. As technology changes. You know, today you'd be using texts or emails or whatever the case may be.
While we hope something on the scale of the Labor Day storm is a long way away, it is reassuring to know that the plans are in place if it were to happen again tomorrow. Some final thoughts coming up as we continue with the Labor Day storm 20 years later.
The Labor Day Storm 20 years later on News Channel 9, sponsored by Bartlett Tree Experts, Homer Men's and Boys Store, and by Surf Pro.
We know the Labor Day storm had a big impact on central New Yorkers, but it also caught the attention of people from around the country and even the world. Several months after the storm, the British television series Eye of the Storm brought a crew to Syracuse to put together a story about the storm we were all so familiar with.
And when this icy 100-mile-an-hour wind descended vertically on the city of Syracuse, well, the people there didn't know what had hit them.
The only concern once those doors open, opening day at 8 o'clock, is that everybody's safe. That's all we care about. And to get hit right in the chest with what happened that night took away what our only goal is once the fair opens, our only mission. And yeah, it does hurt. The memory comes back quite often.
I think that storm taught us that the power of the wind is like nothing else in nature.
I think people in central New York are more weather savvy to warm season weather events, severe thunderstorms, heavy rain events. I mean, it's cumulative. I mean, the National Weather Service, the availability of radar to us now with cell phone apps and whatever your favorite media source might be, it's there and it's ubiquitous now. And people, I see this, people are making decisions based on weather forecasts like I've never seen them do before. We now know that we're no longer insulated from the kind of weather that is more commonly associated with southern parts of the United States. And I think as the climate changes, we're going to be up against, sadly, I think we're going to be up against more of this in the future.
Every Labor Day, I think of that storm, and I think of what we went through, and how much this community suffered, and how much we lost. And I think, could that happen again? So no, I don't ever take a thunderstorm lightly anymore.
Isn't it funny how things work out like that? You know, you have a tragedy that almost closed the church, but so many wonderful offshoots from that. They could have said, you know, you're all done. Close the church up, we'll open up shop someplace else. Well, that didn't happen. Resurrection happened. Resurrection happened.
And you're still here today.
Stronger than ever.
20 years ago, central New York experienced the worst that the atmosphere can throw at us. The storm came and left in an instant, but left an imprint. Even today, whenever I forecast thunderstorms at night, people will ask, will it be as bad as the Labor Day storm? They remember, but they also remember how central New York came back. Thanks for watching, and good night.